Hello viewers, welcome once again. We are still under logic. Christ Almighty God's Algebra. Today we are going to treat signification of law. Signification of law. It is a kind of grace. It's a grace. That means it's logical implication. It's not logical equivalent, it's logical implication. Let us start. Signification of law. Not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q. Is intensification of not bracket P implies Q. So this is a typical example of signification of law. Signification of law. So this is a typical example of it. He said that not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q is intensification of not bracket P implies Q. Now we found out that this equation is not logical equivalent. It is logical implication in the sense that the right hand side of the equation is macrocosm. That means it's a superset of the left hand side of the equation, while the left hand side of the equation is a microcosm. That means it's a subset of the right hand side of the equation. That's why I said that it is intensification, that is, it is increase in value of the left hand side of the equation. That's why it is called signification of law. And it is great. It is grace. It's not law. It says that one is greater than each other. But it is a subset. It is a superset. One is a superset, one is also subset. So let us prove that the equation is true. That means not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies Q is intersection of not bracket P implies Q. Let's prove it. Proof. Suppose not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q. Is intensification of not bracket P implies Q. We assume that the statement is true. We assume that the statement is true and is our hypothesis also. It says suppose that not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q. Is intersection of not bracket P implies Q. Now, you will find out, as I said earlier on, that this equation is not logical equivalent, rather it is logical implication, in the sense that one is a subset to each other, another one is a subset to another one. That's why he said that it is grace, it is logical equivalent. Now, sorry, it is logical implication, not equivalent. It's logical implication. Since it's logical implication, it says that one is a subset to each other. That means the left side equation is a subset to the right hand side of the equation. We are going to transform it to conditional statement and it will still preserve truth. So if and only if not bracket P implies Q implies not P implies not Q. We have now transformed it to conditional statement because it is logical implication. It is grace. No, since this one, the left side equation has now become antecedent, while the right side equation has now become the consequent. And say that whenever the antecedent is true, the consequent must also be true. So whenever I validate statement that not to be negative falsity, always choose. You say that statement is tautology. Is tautology being justified by logical implication? Being justified by logical implication. Now, since not P bracket P implies Q implies not P implies not Q is tautology, we then deduce that certain that not bracket P implies Q exists. That means due to not bracket P implies Q is a proper implication of the consequence not P implies not Q. Now, since antecedent exists, we say that antecedent is logical implication of the consequence not P implies not Q. So if and only if not bracket P implies Q is logical implication of not P implies not Q. We have now deduced that antecedent is logical implication of the consequent. Since it is true that logical implication is the antecedent is logical implication of the consequent. If it is true, also this also must also be true. If and only if not bracket P implies Q is equal to not bracket P implies Q. That means the logical implication is equal to itself. The logical implication is equal to itself. And if it is equal to itself, it means that it is logical equivalent. It says that whenever the right hand side of the equation, the logical implication is true, whenever the left hand side logical implication of the equation is true, also the right hand side also must also be true. In the same way, whenever the right hand side is false, also the left hand side must also be false. We say that it is logical equivalent. Being justified by identity, the sameness. Being justified by identity. If and only if not bracket P implies Q is equal to not bracket. Now let us transform this conditional statement P implies Q to disjunctive statement. Let's transform it. So let's transform it to disjunctive statement using first age case law. So you have not P or Q. It still preserve logical equivalence. I mean, still law. It's still law because the left hand side equation is still equal to the right hand side of the equation. Because whenever the left hand side equation is true, also the right hand side equation is also true. So then whenever the right hand side equation is false, also the left hand side equation is also false. So it's still logical equivalent. So being justified by first age case law. By first age case law. If and only if not bracket P implies Q, not bracket P implies Q is equal to P and G not Q. P, so this is equivalent to this not bracket not P or Q is equivalent to P and not Q by De Morgan's law. So by De Morgan's law, since they are not equivalent, since this not bracket not P or Q is equal to P and not Q, they are not equivalent by De Morgan's law. We substituted P and not Q. We substituted not bracket not P or Q with P and Q. That means we substituted this with this because they are not equivalent by De Morgan's law. By De Morgan's law. If and only if not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q. Now we transform this conditional statement to conditional statement. We have now transformed this conditional statement to conditional statement using Christ Almighty God's grace. We have done Christ Almighty God's grace in our last tutorial. So you can go and be acquainted with Christ Almighty God's grace. So you know that by Christ Almighty God's grace, we say this is equal to this. I mean, this P and not Q is equal to not P implies Q. Is intensification of this P and not Q. And this P and not Q is equal to not bracket P implies Q. So we say that is intensification of not bracket P implies Q being justified by Christ Almighty God's grace. by Christ the Almighty God's grace. Now, you have now proved the statement that not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q is intensification of not bracket P implies Q. We have now proved it. We then conclude, you say, thus, not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q is intensification of not bracket P implies Q. Now, we are going to prove the converse. When we interchange this equation, that means we make the left hand side of the make the right hand side of the equation to become left hand side equation. Then left hand side equation becomes the right hand side equation. It say is extenuation of the left hand side of the equation. That means you are going to prove the converse. So when you prove the converse, by the principle of intentionality, that means the opposite of externality, we then establish that not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q is intensification of not bracket P implies Q. So you say conversely, conversely, not P implies not Q is equal to not bracket P implies Q is extenuation of not P implies not Q. Now, we are going to prove the converse. Now, when you interchange it, when the right answer of the equation becomes the left answer of the equation, the left answer of the equation becomes the right answer of the equation. You see that it's extenuation. You see that this left answer of the equation is a substate to this right answer of the equation is not substate to the left answer of the equation. You see that it is now extenuation. It's now decrease in value of the left answer of the equation, that means not P implies not Q. I'm going to prove it so that we can establish that by the principle of externality that not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies Q is the definition of not bracket P implies Q. We then assume that statement is true. Suppose not P implies not Q is equal to not bracket P implies Q is extenuation of not P implies not Q. We assume that statement is true. That means suppose that not P implies not Q is equal to not bracket P implies Q is extension of not P implies Q. And you know that whenever the right answer of the equation is true, also the equation must also be true. Since that is the case, you're going to transform it to conditional statement and it will preserve tautology, preserve truth. If and only if not P implies not Q implies, sorry, it is this one we imply to this one. I mean, the left side of equation we imply the right side of equation. You have not bracket P implies Q implies not P implies not Q. So that to give us tautology. Because if this implies this, we cannot give us tautology. So that there's possibility of getting falsity. So it's not tautology, it's not truth. Now I see that whenever the accident, you have not transformed it to conditional statement, and whenever accident is true, the consequence must also be true. So whenever I make this statement, this statement, there's no possibility of getting falsity. Always true. You say that the statement is tautology. Is tautology being justified by logical implication? Being justified by logical implication. Now, since the statement is tautology, that will not bracket P implies Q, implies not P implies not Q is tautology. We then deduce that certain that not P implies Q exists because not P bracket P implies Q is proper implication of the consequence not P implies not Q. So since it's certain that not bracket P implies Q exists, we say that not bracket P implies Q is logical implication of the consequence not P implies not Q. That means if and only if not bracket, sorry, you are going to not this one, but we are going to then deduce that this is logical implication. So this is the logical consequence of this one. Because we want to prove that this one equal to this right side of equation equal to the left side of equation is a solution of the right side of the equation. So we said that since the statement is tautology, we then deduce that this not P implies not Q is logical consequence of the not bracket P implies Q. I mean that is it. So we say not P implies not Q is logical consequence of not bracket P implies Q. So this, it is true that not P implies not Q is logical consequence of not bracket P implies Q. So if this is true, also this also must also be true. If and only if not P implies not Q is equal to not P implies not Q. That means the logical consequence is equal to itself. And it is true that logical consequence is equal to itself because by the logical equivalent. So it is logical equivalent. If logical consequence is equal to itself, it is true because it is logical in play, it's logical consequence. because they are equal to each other, being justified by identity. That means the sameness. Being justified by identity. Because to this side, so if and only if not P implies not Q is equal to P or not Q. You have seen that we have now substituted not P implies not Q with P or not Q by first case law. So it's logically equivalent. Not P implies not Q is logically equivalent to P or not Q. So being justified by first case law. By first case law. If and only if not P implies not Q is equal to not bracket not P and D Q. We substitute this P or not Q with not bracket not P and Q because they are logical equivalent by De Morgan's law. By De Morgan's law, and it's still law. The equation is still law. That's still equivalent to each other. Being justified by De Morgan's law. If and only if not P implies not Q is equal to. Now let us transform this one to conditional statement using Almighty God's grace. And if you use Almighty God's grace, the statement will be intensified. That means the letters of equation now will now accelerated. It will be accelerated. It will now decrease in value. If we now transform this one to conditional statement using Christ Almighty God's grace, that means we have not bracket P implies Q. You say that is extenuation of not P implies not Q. So you see that it is decreased in value of this, that not P implies not Q. Being justified by Christ Almighty God's grace. By Christ the Almighty God's grace. I'm sure they have now proved the converse that not P implies not Q is equal to not bracket P implies Q is expression of not P implies not Q. You say thus not P implies not Q is equal to not bracket P implies Q is extenuation of not P implies not Q. Now, having proved the converse, then by the principle of intentionality, we then establish that not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies Q is the definition of not bracket P implies Q. Because by the principle of intentionality, it means that this converse is equal to not bracket P implies Q equal to not P implies not Q is the definition of not bracket P implies Q. So we then conclude therefore not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q is intensification of not intensification of not bracket P implies Q. So by the principle of intentionality, we then establish that not bracket P implies Q is equal to not P implies not Q is intersection of not P bracket P implies Q is signification of law. You have now proved that signification of law exists. So at this juncture, we shall draw our curtain. Thank you, viewers.